You have the ability to regulate the information between corporate oversight and the smart blocker. When an end user uses this tool, we want it to be as transparent as possible. And so the first thing that happens is the user opts in to using the smart blocker tool, and this is to allow the enterprise to provide corporate oversight. And the first question that we're going to ask is a very simple question, and we assume that this first question is going to get approved by both the for both the question that's asked as well as the response. And we can see that here this is just a very simple question. And when the question and response are both approved, from an end user perspective, it's completely transparent. They've asked a question, they've gotten a response. Now the user is going to ask a question that violates a human resources policy. Okay, we'll pause and zoom in. And here, what the end user has done is asked a question about another employee within the company. And we can imagine that this could be full of risks and liabilities, and it could go against the human resources policy. And so in this particular example, the blocker is providing the policy that was violated as well as guidelines for better use of this productivity tool. Finally, we'll ask a question about intellectual property. And here a user is asking for access to source code. Let's assume that it's external source code. And here the question itself is okay, but when the response comes back, if the response includes source code, the smart blocker will reject the response. And here this violates a different corporate policy. And again, we want to provide guidance for the end user so that they get better at using this productivity tool. And finally, we want to take a look at the transactions that are captured for these three questions. So we asked three questions. The first question, both the question and the response were approved. The second question, the question was rejected. And finally, the last question, the response was rejected, the response from the large language model. And so we'll look at the first question. And here we see that a question was asked by an end user, and this question was approved, which led to a response from the large language model, which was also approved. But the second question was immediately rejected by the smart blocker. Okay, and we'll look at the last question here. And in the last question, the user's question was approved, which led to a response from the large language model, which was rejected by the smart blocker. And so what's important here is to understand that the chain of events, very similar to a blockchain network, can't be separated from each other. And so this rejection cannot be separated from the response, which cannot be separated from the approval, which cannot be separated from the original question. So here we're going to take a look at the same question that was asked before by the user, but this time what we'll do is do the traceability from the privacy and the governance policy. So if we remember, there's corporate oversight and then there's the smart blocker. And so as the question is generated, it's important to understand that you have the ability to regulate the information between corporate oversight and the smart blocker. And so for example, here, the corporate oversight gets a superset of the data. They get everything that was actually submitted, all the data and all the metadata, whereas the smart blocker only gets a subset of the information. What is the information that is required in order to perform its function as a utility? So after the smart blocker has gotten the question, it will then generate an approval or a rejection. And here, when that approval or rejection gets generated by the smart blocker, there's two main consumers of this information. So first is corporate oversight. So corporate oversight gets all of the information generated by the smart blocker, whereas the large language model only gets partial information generated by the smart blocker. And so let's take a look at that using the exact same question. So we're asking the same question to the large language model, but this time what we're looking at and tracing from a privacy perspective is the data from the smart blocker as the data producer. And so you've got producers and consumers. So in this case, the smart blocker is the data producer. The corporate oversight department is one of the consumers, but the other consumer is the large language model. And so let's take a look at what that would look like. And so the question gets generated. And what we can see here is that the corporate oversight gets all of the information, including approval, rejection information, whereas the large language model gets only a portion of the information. And what this allows is this, by regulating the granularity of the information that's shared, what you're able to do is provide the corporate oversight without violating the user's data privacy. So now that the smart blocker has approved the question, now it goes to the large language model that's going to generate a response for the question. Now, what the large language model is going to do, now that it's the data producer, it's going to provide all of the information that's required, not only to respond, but all of the relevant information that's required from an explainability perspective. And this information goes onto the decentralized privacy network. And what's important here is that because the large language model is the producer, it will be able to regulate who has access to what information. And so all of the information becomes available to the explainability engine, whereas only a limited portion of information becomes available to the smart blocker handling the response. And so what we'll do is we'll continue asking the exact same question, but we'll look at the privacy from the perspective of the large language model. And so the question goes through, it reaches the large language model. The large language model will generate a response which will include all of the information that's required for explainability. And this is really important from a regulatory perspective, compliance perspective, and all of the new laws that are cropping up to deal with AI and large language models. And so we can see here that if we zoom in, the large language model is generating the response along with all of the relevant information that might be required for explainability. But when we look at the smart blocker handling the response, it's only getting the question, and all of those details associated with explainability are hidden from the smart blocker handling the response.